in 1929. A trade magazine called Macaroni Journal published a story so seductive that it ended up deceiving the world for almost a century. The article was titled A Saga of Cathay and told that during Marco Polo's voyage, a sailor from his crew had found on the coast of China a beautiful woman who was preparing long, thin strips of dough and boiling them in water. Fascinated, that sailor supposedly took the discovery to his captain, and Marco Polo, upon returning to Venice in 1295, supposedly introduced pasta to Italy. The story even gave a name to the supposed sailor. They called him Spaghetti. It was the perfect kind of tale to stick in the memory. Exotic, simple, romantic, and easy to repeat at a family table. What almost no one knew was that this anecdote did not come from a medieval manuscript or a travel chronicle. It had been invented by the National Macaroni Manufacturers Association as a marketing maneuver to sell more pasta to American consumers. And it worked. The myth jumped from advertisements to classrooms, from family conversations to popular culture, and ended up appearing in a 1938 Hollywood movie, The Adventures of Marco Polo, where Gary Cooper sits in a Chinese house and asks about the dish he is being served. His host calls it spaghetti. But by then, pasta was already being mass-produced and exported across the Mediterranean more than 140 years before Marco Polo ever set foot on Venetian soil again. The food that many consider the most Italian symbol on the planet was not born the way we were told, and the true story of its origin is much stranger, older, and more fascinating than any legend invented by a trade magazine, because sometimes the history of a food does not begin with a famous hero, but with a disaster, with hardened earth, with almost invisible remains that survive by pure chance. The oldest known noodles to date did not appear in a kitchen, a market, or a palace pantry. They were found under 3 meters of rubble caused by an earthquake in a destroyed settlement near the upper reaches of the Yellow River in northwestern China. In 2002, a team of archaeologists was excavating the site in Qinghai province, a community that had been devastated by an earthquake and a catastrophic flood some 400 years ago. The tragedy was so sudden that it left fragments of daily life frozen, almost like a photograph, buried in ancient sediments. Grouped bodies and scattered pots were found, as if someone had abandoned them in mid-use, and among the ruins appeared an overturned clay bowl, buried deep under the compact earth. When researchers carefully turned it over and removed the accumulated dirt, they saw at the bottom some yellowish, thin, curved, and brittle strands, but unmistakable in their shape. They were noodles. The archaeologist who made the discovery, Ye Maolin, of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, immediately understood the importance of what he had before him. He placed the remains back inside the bowl, sealed the container to prevent contamination, and sent it to a laboratory in Beijing. For 2 years, those noodles remained stored under controlled conditions while researchers discussed how to analyze them without destroying such fragile material. It was not a common object. It was a possible direct window into the kitchen of a vanished civilization. Finally, in 2004, Professor Hu Yuanlu of the Institute of Geology and Geophysics of the Chinese Academy of Sciences began the examination. He used phytolith analysis, which allows for the identification of plants from tiny mineral particles preserved in their cells, and starch grain tests to determine what they were made of. The results published in Nature in 2005 forced a rewriting of part of the world's food history. Those noodles were made with 2 types of millet: broomcorn millet and foxtail millet. Cereals, native to northern China, cultivated in the region for at least 7,000 years. The flour had been finely milled, mixed with water to form a dough, and probably hand-pulled into long strands. A technique that still survives in Chinese lamien. Radiocarbon dating placed the remains at about 4,000 years old within the Qijia culture, which lived on the terraces above the Yellow River. Archaeochemist Patrick McGovern of the University of Pennsylvania called the finding astonishing and noted that even today, making long, thin noodles like those requires considerable skill. In other words, someone in ancient China was already hand-pulling dough on the banks of the Yellow River about 200 years before the founding of Rome. Here is where the story takes a turn that almost no one expects. Before proclaiming China as the cradle of all pasta, there is an essential detail that completely changes the equation. Those ancient millet noodles and the pasta that centuries later would conquer Italy. According to practically all serious historical accounts, distinct inventions born in different worlds. Chinese noodles were made with millet and soft wheat. Mediterranean pasta, on the other hand, the kind that could be dried on wooden racks under the sun, stored for months in barrels, travel on merchant ships across the Mediterranean, and boiled weeks later without falling apart, needed another cereal, hard wheat or durum. This wheat is more compact, more resistant, and contains a higher concentration of gluten, which gives dried pasta its structure, its firm bite, and that ability to hold its shape even in a boiling pot. Soft wheat does not allow for that result. Food historian Barbara Santich explained it directly. Chinese noodles were made with soft wheat because that was the wheat available in China during that period. With that ingredient, they could not create dried pasta. That is why Chinese noodles did not evolve into Mediterranean pasta, and pasta did not travel from China to Italy in the hands of Marco Polo. The confusion between noodles and pasta, treating them as if they were the same food just because both can be in the shape of long strips of cooked dough, was precisely what allowed the myth to survive for so long without being questioned. If pasta and noodles were interchangeable, then it would seem logical to imagine someone bringing an invention from one civilization to another. But if we are talking about parallel creations arising from different grains, different techniques, and different societies, without solid proof of direct contact between them, that whole narrative collapses. And it collapses completely. Food can appear independently in different places, at different times, without any connection between them. Let's think about bread. Let's think about beer. Let's think about stuffed doughs, grain, water, and heat form such a basic combination that any hungry civilization could discover it. And many ancient cultures did so separately over and over again for thousands of years. Now, some historians have tried to push the origin of Italian pasta even further back in time, beyond the Arabs, beyond the Silk Road, all the way to ancient Rome and the Etruscans. There is an Etruscan funerary relief dated around the 4th century before our era, which certain scholars have interpreted as a scene with tools for making pasta, rolling pins, cutting boards, and something that might look like a drying rack. The problem is that the evidence is weak, and when looked at carefully, it is not enough to support such a grand conclusion. Even if those tools were used for cooking, they were most likely related to a food called testaroli, a sort of ancient hybrid between flatbread and pasta that is still eaten in some areas of Tuscany and Liguria. Testaroli is prepared by pouring a liquid batter onto a hot surface, cooking it like a crepe-like disc, then cutting it into diamond shapes and briefly passing it through boiling water. It is a delicious and very ancient dish, but it is not pasta in the modern sense of the word. The Romans, for their part, also ate something called leganum, thin sheets of dough that were baked or fried instead of boiled. The 1st century Roman recipe book attributed to Apicius mentions legain as layers of dough combined with meat and sauce, something closer to a proto-lasagna than a plate of spaghetti. But baked sheets of dough are a far cry from the dried, boiled, and extruded pasta that would conquer the world centuries later. The decisive innovation was not simply mixing flour with water, it was drying the dough so it could be stored, transported, and cooked much later. And that innovation belonged to the Arab world. So, if pasta did not arrive from China to Italy in the luggage of a Venetian merchant, how did it really appear on Italian shores? The answer involves Arab merchants, travelers, and conquerors, a group that rarely receives all the credit it deserves in this story. For centuries, Arab merchants and travelers crossed the vast deserts of North Africa and the Middle East, following trade routes that connected the markets of Baghdad with the ports of the Mediterranean. Those journeys could last weeks or months, and those who undertook them needed food capable of withstanding extreme conditions. Fresh bread hardens in a few days. Cooked grains spoil quickly in the heat. But strips of dough made with durum wheat and water, rolled out, cut, and dried, could be wrapped in cloth, loaded onto camels, and preserved for months without refrigeration. For a world of caravans, ports, and long journeys, that was a brilliant solution. Light, resistant, nutritious, and easy to prepare upon reaching the destination. By the 9th century, Arab cooks had already perfected a product called itria, long, thin strands of dried dough made with durum wheat, capable of being stored for a long time and boiled in water when a meal was needed. A 9th century text, written by Ibn al-Mubarak in the region that corresponds today to modern Iraq, describes strips of boiled dough resembling thin noodles, one of the first clear written references to something we would recognize as pasta. The word itria itself leaves a fascinating linguistic trail across several civilizations. Scholars have traced it from Arabic to an older Greek word, itrion or itria, which described a dough of flour and water rolled into thin sheets and cut into strips. Syria had once been an area deeply marked by Greek culture, and as Greek and Arabic mixed over centuries of trade, conquest, and cultural exchange, the word and the recipe traveled together through the ancient world. There was also the Persian term laksha, meaning slippery, which was used to describe noodles in much of the Middle East and Central Asia. That word traveled east to Indonesia, where it became laksa, and west to Eastern Europe, where related forms survive like laska in Hungarian, lapsha in Russian, loksina in Ukrainian, and lakstinii in Lithuanian. The dried pasta that the world today imagines as the quintessential Italian food was for centuries a product of the Arabic-speaking world and the vast trade networks that connected the Middle East with every corner of the Mediterranean basin. Pay attention to this detail because it explains how pasta definitively settled in Europe. The Arabs not only traded dried pasta along desert caravan routes, they also brought it with them when they advanced into the European continent. In the 9th century, Muslim forces from North Africa invaded and occupied Sicily, the large triangular island situated at one of the most important strategic crossroads of the Mediterranean Sea. Controlling Sicily meant looking simultaneously toward Africa, the East, and the Italian peninsula. With them came durum wheat seeds, more advanced irrigation systems, sugarcane, citrus trees, and, of course, their dried pasta. Sicily turned out to be the perfect place for that food. The intense sun, the warm climate, and the constant coastal breezes allowed pasta to be dried outdoors on wooden racks with extraordinary efficiency. In a few generations, the island ceased to be just a transit point and became a true center of production, capable of supplying both local populations and merchants from other shores. The first clear written reference to pasta in Western Europe does not come from an Italian source, but from an Arab geographer in 1154. Muhammad al-Idrisi, a scholar working at the court of the Norman king Roger II of Sicily, completed a massive geographical work known as the Book of Roger. In it, he described the town of Trabia, near Palermo, where he noted that a large quantity of pasta was produced and exported to Calabria and other Muslim and Christian territories. This means that before the 14th century began, pasta was already being manufactured in Sicilian workshops on an almost industrial scale and shipped to international markets. Commercial contracts from Genoa between 1157 and 1160, recorded by the notary Giovanni Scriba, confirm significant imports of Sicilian pasta to the Italian peninsula, Genoa, which would later build its own fame as a pasta capital, was in those early centuries primarily a buyer and distributor. The product that arrived on Genoese ships had been developed under Arab rule, dried under the Sicilian sun, and moved along maritime routes linking North Africa with the ports of continental Europe. And it was not an isolated influence. The Arab presence profoundly transformed the agriculture, the language, and the culinary identity of Sicily, to the point that its traces are still recognized today in everyday flavors, technique, and words. Many Sicilian words linked to food retain Arabic roots. The famous cassata takes its name from casa, which means bowl. The granita that tourists seek out in Palermo descends from sherbet, a sweet and cold drink. Even Sicilian couscous, which surprises many Italians, is a direct inheritance of North African Arab cuisine. The pasta that would end up defining Italian identity to the world was born precisely in that cultural collision among Arab inventiveness, Mediterranean roots, and the privileged geography of Sicily. One document in particular finally drives the last nail into the coffin of the Marco Polo myth. It is a will dated 1279, written by a Genoese soldier named Ponzio Bastone. Among his possessions appeared a basket of macaroni, valuable enough to be left as an inheritance to his relatives. The pasta was listed alongside clothing, furniture, and other domestic goods, suggesting it was not a newly arrived exotic rarity from the East, but a known and appreciated product within the everyday pantry. That legal document was drafted when Marco Polo was still in the immense Mongol Empire, several years before his return to Venice. So pasta was not only present in Italy before Marco Polo returned home, it was already common and valuable enough to appear in routine inheritance papers. That detail is more devastating than any legend. It does not speak of adventures, but of a domestic reality that already existed. During the Middle Ages, pasta spread throughout the Italian peninsula. Although it did not yet hold the central place it would later have, it was often served as a side dish alongside roasted meats on wealthy tables, or eaten simply with a little salt and cheese among the poorer sectors. In that period, one of the most enduring associations in Italian cuisine was born: the union between pasta and grated cheese, especially Parmesan from Emilia-Romagna. It was such an ancient pairing that food historian Massimo Montanari has written that one cannot understand the history of Parmesan without understanding the history of pasta. Both products grew together, propelling each other. The more pasta was eaten, the more sense it made to grate cheese over it, and the more prestige the cheese gained, the more attractive the dish became. But the city that finally elevated pasta from a regional food to a national symbol was Naples. During the 15th century, Neapolitan engineers and artisans developed a revolutionary method for mechanically extruding the dough through bronze dies. Enormous quantities of wheat dough were pressed through perforated metal plates using large hand-operated screw presses. Before this innovation, every strand had to be formed manually. A slow, irregular, and overly expensive process for feeding an entire city. The bronze dye changed the economics of pasta almost overnight. Suddenly, dried spaghetti and macaroni could be produced quickly and cheaply enough to feed a relentlessly growing urban population. Naples, between the 10th and 16th centuries, was one of the largest and most densely populated cities in Europe. Chaotic, noisy, full of workers who needed cheap, filling food available on the street. Pasta answered that need perfectly. The streets filled with open-air vendors offering bowls of simple macaroni for a few coins, and with enormous wooden racks where long golden strands of spaghetti hung in neat rows, swaying in the warm breeze blowing in from the Bay of Naples. European travelers who visited the city during that period described the spectacle with a mix of fascination and horror. They recounted that Neapolitans ate long strips of pasta with their bare hands, tilting their heads back and dropping endless strands into their open mouths. The fork had not yet become the standard utensil for eating pasta. By the 19th century, Neapolitans had already claimed the nickname Mangia Macaroni, macaroni eaters, a title originally applied to the Sicilians who had promoted the product centuries earlier. The Italian playwright Carlo Goldoni, who lived in Paris in the late 18th century, remembered hearing the French joke that it was useless to offer an Italian anything other than pasta. Macaroni, macaroni, macaroni. Even the great statesman Camillo Benso di Cavour, on the eve of uniting southern Italy with the north, supposedly declared that the macaroni is cooked and we will eat it. But everything happened without the ingredient that today is considered inseparable from the dish. There were no tomatoes. Before the arrival of the tomato, pasta was served in ways that would seem almost unrecognizable to us today. It was mixed with grated cheese, melted butter, olive oil, or simply with a pinch of salt. At aristocratic Renaissance tables, cooks might combine it with sweet and spiced preparations that would sound strange now. Sugar, cinnamon, raisin, and even meat from cow udders. Pre-tomato Italy was not red. Its sauces were white, brown, or green, made with nuts, animal fat, hair pastas, and aged cheeses. The tomato arrived in Europe from America in the mid-10th century, probably entering Italy through the port of Naples, which at that time was under Spanish rule. But its arrival did not provoke immediate enthusiasm. On the contrary, for a long time, Europeans viewed it with suspicion. The tomato belongs to the nightshade family, related to poisonous plants, and that association was enough for many to consider it dangerous. For almost 2 centuries, most people avoided putting it in their mouths. They called it pomodoro, golden apple, because the first varieties that reached Italian shores were small and yellow, not the large red fruits we imagine today. Wealthy collectors grew them as ornamental curiosities in gardens. Some herbalists speculated about supposed aphrodisiac properties, but almost no one thought of cooking them. The tomato was there, visible, attractive, and strange, waiting for someone to dare to turn it into food and forever change the flavor of an entire cuisine. It took until the late 18th century for more daring cooks in southern Italy to begin experimenting. The first known published reference to a tomato sauce in Italian cuisine appeared in 1692 inches, the book Lo Scalco alla Moderna, written by the Neapolitan chef Antonio Latini. However, the specific combination that would change world cuisine forever, pasta served with tomato sauce, does not appear in any written record until 1790 inches L'Appicio Moderno by chef Francesco Lenardi. Stop for a second to think about it. The dish that billions of people consider the absolute image of Italian food. Spaghetti with red sauce has only existed in texts for about 235 years. The United States is older than pasta with tomato. It is not an exaggeration. It is one of those historical truths that sound impossible only because habit makes us believe they were always there. The tomato completely transformed the Italians' relationship with pasta. It provided intense color, freshness, brightness, and an acidity capable of perfectly balancing the density of the starch. Furthermore, it was cheap. It grew abundantly in the volcanic soils surrounding Naples and Mount Vesuvius, and could be preserved for the winter by sun-drying it into a thick, concentrated paste called estrato. The union between pasta and tomato was not a grand culinary plan. It was a perfect accident of geography and economics. A South American fruit arrived in a European city that already had a centuries-old tradition of eating dried Arab wheat noodles. And one day, someone put both things on the same plate. One of the first admirers of pasta outside of Italy was Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States. During the 1780s, Jefferson served as the American minister to France and used that diplomatic position to travel through Italy with an almost scientific curiosity. When he arrived in Naples, he was truly fascinated. He did not see pasta merely as a tasty dish, but as a culinary technology worthy of study. In his travel journals, Jefferson noted meticulous details of the production process, the durum wheat flour called semola, the operation of the bronze extrusion presses, and the exact method by which the dough was pushed through perforated metal plates to form long, uniform strands. He even drew sketches of the machines with cross-sections, showing how a screw mechanism pressed the dough down until it passed through the die. In February 1789, Jefferson wrote to his private secretary, William Short, asking him to find and buy a macaroni mold. The machine ended up arriving at his Monticello estate in Virginia, where he used it to prepare pasta for his guests. During his presidency, Jefferson served macaroni and cheese at White House dinners, introducing that dish to many Americans who had never tasted it. His handwritten pasta recipe is still preserved in the Library of Congress. 6 eggs, yolks and whites, 2 glasses of milk, 2 pounds of flour, and a little salt. Everything was to be worked together, without water, and very well. Jefferson planted the seed, but the true explosion of pasta in the United States came decades later, driven not by presidential dinners, but by poverty, nostalgia, and the need to survive. Starting in the 1880s, millions of Italians, mostly from the poorest regions of the country's south, began to leave their land in search of a better life on the other side of the Atlantic. In the 1880s alone, some 300,000 Italians arrived in the United States. In the following decade, the figure almost doubled to reach around 600 bm. Ling ling ling. These immigrants came from Naples, Sicily, Calabria, Apulia, and all over the Mezzogiorno. Precisely the areas where dried pasta had for generations been a cheap, everyday, and deeply familiar food. They carried spaghetti and macaroni in trunks and suitcases, but they also carried something harder to measure: recipes learned by heart, inherited gestures in the kitchen, and an emotional connection to a dish that tasted like home. For many, pasta was not a gastronomic fad. It was a way to preserve identity in a strange country and to gather the family around a simple table in neighborhoods like Little Italy in Lower Manhattan, the North End in Boston, or the Hill in St. Planks, Louis. Italian immigrants opened grocery stores, bakeries, and small restaurants that introduced pasta to millions of Americans. the first pasta factory in the United States, in fact, had been founded earlier, in 1848, by a Frenchman named Antoine Zarega in Brooklyn, New York. But it was the massive Italian migratory wave of the late 19th and early 20th centuries that transformed pasta from a specialized and somewhat unknown product into a common meal within the American home by the 1920s, 1930. Spaghetti with meatballs, a dish that barely existed in Italy in that way, had already become a regular dinner in homes from coast to coast. The same story repeated itself wherever Italian communities settled. In Buenos Aires, they brought pasta to Argentina, where it mixed with the local meat culture and gave rise to dishes like tallarines con tuco. In São Paulo, they took it to Brazil, in Melbourne and Sydney, to Australia. Wherever Italians went, pasta traveled with them, tucked into their luggage, and then woven into the daily life of every community they built. And since those who took it to all those corners of the world were Italians, pasta was forever marked as Italian in the global imagination. The previous chapters, the Chinese millet noodles, the arrabbiatria, the Sicilian workshops under Muslim governors, were left buried under the enormous weight of Italian cultural identity. They did not disappear, but they stopped being the visible part of the story. But the international expansion of pasta had begun even before those migrations. During the era of the Grand Tour, in the 17th century, wealthy young men from England, France, and Germany traveled through Italy as a rite of passage, visiting Roman ruins, Florentine galleries, and Neapolitan markets. They ate pasta in the streets of Naples and in the dining rooms of Roman palaces, and many returned with that flavor in their memory. The English poet Lord Byron consumed it during his years in Italy, and the word macaroni entered English as a mockery to describe an elegant, somewhat ridiculous young man, too affected by continental fashions. If you ever wondered what it meant that Yankee Doodle stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni, there is the connection. Macaroni meant modern, exaggerated, absurdly European. It was a reference to pasta hidden inside an Independence War song, and almost no one notices it today, even within Italy. The dominance of pasta was not always celebrated without resistance. In the 1930s, at the height of Mussolini's fascist regime, the futurist art movement launched a campaign against it that was as strange as it was revealing. Its leader, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, published a manifesto calling for the abolition of pasta from the Italian diet. According to him, it made people heavy, slow, pessimistic, and brutal. The futurists wanted an Italy obsessed with speed, machines, modern energy, and a break from everything ancient. For them, pasta represented just the opposite: laziness, tradition, slowness, and attachment to the past. It was, in their imagination, an anchor placed on the body of a nation they wished to turn into a motor. The reaction of the Italian public was one of outrage. Pasta survived the futurist attack with barely a scratch. And that episode ended up further strengthening the country's emotional bond with the food that had already become its most recognizable symbol to the world. Therein lies the great irony of this whole story. Pasta is Italian in the same way that the English language is English. Yes, England was the place where that language was formalized, codified in dictionaries, ordered with grammars, and then exported to every continent. But English is built with Germanic roots, French vocabulary, Latin structures, Greek scientific terms, and Old Norse words brought by Viking invaders. It is a mixed language formed by layers, borrowings, and conquests that absorbed everything it touched until it sounded as if it had always belonged to it. With pasta, exactly the same thing happens. Chinese hands stretched millet, noodles, 4,000 years ago next to the Yellow River. Arab merchants dried strips of durum wheat to create a portable food capable of withstanding journeys across scorching deserts and long sea voyages. Sicilian producers under Arab influence increased production under the Mediterranean sun. Neapolitan engineers mechanized the process with bronze dies and enormous screw presses. A South American fruit arrived by colonial accident at a European port and stayed forever. And finally, millions of Italian immigrants took that already transformed product to every inhabited continent on Earth. No one completely owns pasta. Everyone built it. What remains is not only who made it first, but what it became after passing through so many hands, so many trade routes, and so many centuries of adaptation. Today there are more than 300 recognized shapes of pasta in Italy alone, and new ones are still appearing. There are the long golden strands of southern spaghetti, the small ear-shaped orecchiette of Apulia, pressed one by one with the thumb against rough wooden boards, the stuffed tortellini of Emilia-Romagna, which legend says were inspired by the navel of the goddess Venus, and the ridged tubes of rigatoni, which are eaten in Roman trattorias with pagata or cacio e pepe. Every Italian region has its preferred shapes, its own sauces, and its almost sacred opinions on the correct way to cook them. They are not simple decorative variations. Italians can argue for hours about whether carbonara should use guanciale or pancetta, whether it is a sacrilege to break spaghetti before putting it in the pot, or whether cream should even come close to a plate of pasta. That passion is real, deep, and everyday. Each shape was born in a specific place to embrace a specific sauce, a local economy, and a family memory. That is why, when someone corrects a recipe, many times they are not just defending culinary technique, but a small heritage passed down at home. That is why pasta is not a single invention of a single civilization. It is a collaboration of 000 years, 3 continents, and dozens of cultures. And perhaps that is precisely the most Italian thing of all. Because if Italian culture has demonstrated anything time and time again over the centuries, it is an extraordinary ability to take the best of what arrives on its shores, transform it with sensitivity, technique, and pride, and turn it into something unmistakably, permanently, beautifully its own. If this story made you look at a plate of pasta with different eyes, subscribe to The Origin of Everything and leave in the comments which gastronomic origin you want us to explore next.